A young mother was found dead in her own home, and from the very first days of the investigation, detectives felt the answer was right there in plain sight. But the deeper they dug, the more strange and puzzling details they uncovered. And when they finally got to the truth, it turned out to be so unexpected it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Sarah Williamson was born on June 20th, 1963, in Florida. Her father served in the Army, so for a time, the family lived on a military base before eventually settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At school, Sarah stood out right away, especially in math. It later turned out her IQ was exceptionally high, and she earned top grades with very little effort. She also loved to read, gravitating towards crime novels, and by her later high school years she was already thinking about writing one of her own. She was also energetic and outgoing, had plenty of friends, and loved spending time with her older sister. After graduating, she enrolled at a university not far from Albuquerque and earned a degree in mathematics. While she was studying, she met a man named Cohen, and once they both finished their degrees, they got married. Sarah had planned to continue on to a master's in statistics, but she received a very attractive job offer at a military base. After working there for a while, she and her husband moved to Maryland, where she landed a position as a statistical analyst with the National Security Agency. It was a major leap in her career, and Sarah quickly proved herself as a talented problem solver who could take on challenges of any size. Around that same time, she began writing her own crime novel about a statistician who solves a murder. 3 years into her marriage, Sarah's relationship with her husband started to fall apart, and eventually, they decided to get a divorce. She kept working at the NSA and also decided to finally pursue her master's in statistics. Sarah enrolled in evening classes at Johns Hopkins University, where she met another student named Lorenzo. At the time she was 27 and he was 25. Lorenzo was working towards a degree in business and finance, and like Sarah, he had already been married once before. The two started dating, and after Sarah completed her master's, she married him. They settled in a well-off neighborhood called Elkridge, just outside Baltimore. 3 years later, they had a son, but almost immediately after his birth, Lorenzo began to pull away from the family. His behavior changed drastically. He became controlling of Sarah's every move and showed almost no interest in their child. Eventually, Sarah decided to file for divorce. Lorenzo moved back in with his parents, who lived nearby, and they agreed their son would spend weekends with him while living with Sarah the rest of the time. At the time, Sarah was 35, and her son had just turned 1. On Friday, November 13th, 1998, she dropped him off at Lorenzo's house, then spent the next day with her best friend, Laura. The following morning, Sunday, Laura woke up expecting a call from Sarah, because they had planned to talk, but Sarah never called. Laura tried contacting her, but she didn't answer. That's when Laura noticed she had a voicemail waiting. It had been left at 8:46 p.m. the night before, while she was already asleep. Back then, voicemail didn't show who had called unless you dialed in to listen. Still, Laura figured it might be from Sarah and pressed play. To her horror, she heard chaos on the line, strange noises, then a woman screaming, followed by the sounds of a violent struggle. It sounded like someone was being attacked in real time. Shaken, Laura immediately contacted police. She asked them to check on Sarah, and officers were dispatched to her home. The first thing they noticed was that the window next to the front door had been shattered, yet the door itself was locked, and no one came when they knocked. Circling around, they found the sliding glass door at the back unlocked and went inside. What stood out immediately was that the alarm system on that door was still armed, which made little sense. If someone had broken in through the front, the alarm should have gone off. When they entered the living room, they were met with a gruesome sight. Sarah's body lay sprawled on the floor in a massive pool of blood. The walls, furniture, even the ceiling were also splattered with it. Fearing the worst, officers hurried through the rest of the house, searching for Sarah's baby. Not knowing he was with his father, they immediately assumed he might have been kidnapped. Sarah's body was sent to the medical examiner, while detectives focused on processing the crime scene. They quickly determined that the killer had most likely entered through the broken front window. That window was also wired to the alarm system, But the sensor was on the frame, so it would only trigger if the window was opened. Smashing the glass didn't set it off. Bloody fingerprints showed that the intruder also used the same window to leave. Inside, investigators noticed something strange. Someone had pulled out all the VHS tapes from a drawer in the living room and scattered them across the floor. And the VCR itself was missing. In the kitchen, every cabinet door had been thrown open, like someone was searching for something specific. At first glance, it looked like a burglary, but detectives quickly started to doubt that theory. Sarah's laptop and wallet were sitting untouched on the kitchen table. It felt more like someone had staged the scene to look like a break-in, covering up a much darker motive. The autopsy only reinforced that suspicion. Sarah had been stabbed repeatedly with wounds across her entire body. The sheer level of violence suggested deep, personal anger or hatred toward her. Detectives also couldn't figure out why the killer chose to smash the front window. The back of the house faced the woods and would have offered a much safer way in without drawing attention. That led them to believe the attacker might have known exactly how the alarm system worked and realized that breaking the back door glass would have likely triggered it. Forensics didn't find any usable fingerprints or solid evidence. All they could do was gather up the huge amounts of blood left behind, hoping that somewhere in the mess, they might pick up traces of the killer's DNA, if he'd cut himself during the brutal attack. Meanwhile, officers searched the backyard and discovered a machete, which they believed was the murder weapon. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds on Sarah's body matched it exactly. While experts worked through the evidence, detectives confirmed that Sarah's little boy was safe with his father. With that worry off the table, they turned their focus to interviewing Sarah's friends and family. They wanted to know if she'd had any conflicts leading up to her death. But everyone said the same thing. Sarah was kind, easygoing, and never fought with anyone. The only exception was her ex-husband, Lorenzo. Sarah's best friend, Laura, explained to investigators that the divorce had been rough. After their son was born, Lorenzo's behavior completely changed. He had been on antidepressants before, but stopped taking them once the baby arrived. From then on, Sarah noticed he showed no interest in spending time with her son. But that wasn't all. Lorenzo also grew controlling, watching her every move. Over time, Sarah started to feel like he was angry at her for giving more attention to their newborn than to him. Sometime later, after Sarah went back to work, Lorenzo started accusing her of having an affair with her boss. He even showed up at her workplace. Since she worked for the NSA, his accusations triggered a full-scale internal investigation and interviews with dozens of employees. In the end, investigators found absolutely no evidence to back up his claims. Still, Lorenzo refused to let it go. During one of their fights, he even pulled a gun on Sarah. That was the breaking point, and she filed for divorce. When Lorenzo found out about it, he tried to hit her while she was holding their baby. Sarah fell, and Lorenzo snatched the child and walked out. He dropped the baby off at his parents' house, then came back and told Sarah she had to sleep with him, or she'd never see her son again. After that, Sarah went straight to the police and got a restraining order against him, but no other action was taken. From then on, she only saw him in court, where they were battling over custody, or when she dropped their son off at Lorenzo's parents' house on weekends, since the court ruled he had visitation rights. At one point, Lorenzo even tried to get a passport for his son so he could take him out of the country, but the court shut that down. Sarah's sister later revealed that just one day before the murder, Sarah had called her and said she was genuinely afraid of Lorenzo. She was worried he might hurt her before the court made a final decision about custody of their son. Sarah even asked her sister to look after the child if anything ever happened to her, because she didn't want Lorenzo raising him. That alone was enough for detectives to take a closer look at Lorenzo, so they went to speak with him. When they told him Sarah had been found dead, he dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and started screaming. Once he calmed down, investigators began asking questions. Lorenzo denied any involvement and insisted they should look into her boss, claiming Sarah had been having an affair with him. As for himself, he said he was at home. Knight and his whole family backed him up. Detectives knew that kind of alibi wasn't rock-solid. Family members could easily be covering for him. They took his DNA and fingerprints and also checked him for any scratches that might have come from a struggle, but he didn't have a single mark on him. They then got a warrant to search Lorenzo's house and car, but once again came off empty. No blood, no shoes matching the prints left in Sarah's house, and no other evidence that could tie him to the crime. In the end, Lorenzo hired a strong defense attorney, which forced detectives to shift their focus. They decided to check out Sarah's former boss, but by then he had already left the NSA and moved away. When the NSA learned about Sarah's murder, they decided to assign their own team to investigate the case alongside local police. They reached out to Sarah's former boss, and once again, he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. He also said that on the night of the murder, he was having dinner with friends in another state, and that alibi checked out. With no other real leads, detectives tried to squeeze more information out of the voicemail Sarah had left her friend in the middle of the attack. They were hoping to catch the killer's voice, but instead, they picked up something else. After experts cleaned up the recording, investigators thought they could hear Sarah screaming the name Mike. That immediately raised a red flag, because Lorenzo's brother was named Michelangelo, but he went by Mike. He lived in the same house with Lorenzo and their parents, and according to him, he'd been home the night Sarah was killed. Detectives started wondering if Mike might have carried out the murder himself, maybe to make sure the child stayed in their family. They brought him in for questioning and played the enhanced tape for him, but he said he couldn't hear his name on it at all. And to be fair, the theory was shaky from the start because even on the cleaned-up version, the recording was so unclear that you couldn't make out any distinct words. Mike denied having anything to do with the murder, but during questioning, detectives noticed he was visibly shaking. And when they drove him back home, the moment he stepped out of the car, he immediately threw up. It all looked suspicious, so the lead detective gave him his phone number and told him to call if he ever decided to come clean. But instead, Lorenzo's attorney reached out to police and said that from now on, they'd only be allowed to speak to his brother in the presence of a lawyer. After that, detectives checked out Sarah's first husband as well as Lorenzo's ex-wife, but both were cleared. As for Lorenzo's ex-wife, investigators asked if she'd be willing to help them, and she agreed. Police tapped her phone and she called Lorenzo, carefully trying to coax something new out of him, but he stuck to his original story and kept insisting he had no idea who killed Sarah. There was also another theory tied to Sarah's job at the NSA. She had access to classified information, and detectives couldn't rule out that this might have been a motive. But the special team from the NSA looked into it and ultimately concluded there was no connection between her work and the crime. A month after the murder, the lab finally finished processing all the evidence from Sarah's house, and they found DNA from an unidentified man in 3 different blood samples. Detectives immediately compared it to Lorenzo's DNA, and to their surprise, it wasn't a match. The same went for his brother and his father. The blood didn't belong to any of them. This twist shocked investigators, who had been almost certain Lorenzo was involved. But now, with the DNA pointing to a completely different man, his guilt didn't look so clear anymore. The problem was, without any other leads, there was no way to figure out who the real killer was, and the case went cold for months. Detectives kept digging, even checking known serial offenders in the area, but nothing came of it. Later, they sent the voicemail recording to the FBI, where experts were able to clean it up more effectively. Turned out, Sarah hadn't said Mike at all. It was just a scream. That went on for 7 months, until the case suddenly took a shocking turn. On June 1st, 1999, the lead detective got a call from the Baltimore County Police Department. An officer there explained that one of their inmates had just confessed to killing Sarah. The inmate was a 19-year-old named Ardell Tickles, who'd been arrested 3 months earlier for an armed robbery at a McDonald's. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, he told his cellmate that he'd murdered a woman in her own home. The cellmate quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, wore a wire, and started asking Ardell for details about the killing. Ardell explained how he'd broken into the house through a window and attacked the victim with a machete. He described her injuries with such precision that detectives had no doubt he was talking about Sarah. He even gave the exact date it happened, the night she was killed. Ardell bragged about how his victim died while he kept striking her, saying he wanted her to suffer as much as possible. Finally, when his cellmate asked why he'd done it, Ardell gave an answer that floored detectives. He said a former coworker had paid him $5,000 to kill her. Investigators were convinced he wasn't lying about being the killer. His confession included details that had never been released to the public. The lead detective headed straight to the jail to confront him. He told Ardell he'd be facing first-degree murder charges and made it clear that they already had his confession on tape, so he'd better start talking. Ardell didn't deny a thing. He admitted he had killed the woman without even knowing her name. He added that he didn't feel any remorse, because according to him, Sarah was a bad person. He claimed the former coworker who hired him for the job told him that Sarah once pushed a pregnant black woman down a flight of stairs and spit in her face. Ardell also said that instead of the promised $5,000, he only got $3,000, but the money didn't matter to him as much as punishing her for what she'd supposedly done. At that point, the detectives laid out 3 photos, Lorenzo, his brother, and his father, and asked Ardell which one of them had hired him. To his surprise, Ardell didn't recognize any of them. He explained that the person who hired him wasn't a man at all, but a woman, though he didn't know her name. That raised even more questions. How could he have worked with this woman and not even know who she was? And what kind of woman would want Sarah dead? One thing was clear, though, this woman knew Sarah very well. According to Ardell, just days before the murder, she drove Ardell to Sarah's house and told him the best time to strike would be Saturday because Sarah would be home alone. She even explained how her alarm system was set up and warned him not to tamper with it, so the neighbors wouldn't hear a thing. With this new lead in hand, detectives shifted their focus to finding the woman behind it all. Ardell had worked at a nursing home laundry in Baltimore, so police pulled the employee roster, hoping he'd recognize someone. But what they stumbled across was far more shocking. One name on that list instantly told them who the mysterious woman was. Her name was Amelia, and she was Lorenzo's mother. Detectives went back to the jail and showed Ardell a photo of Amelia. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was the one who had hired him. What really stunned him, though, was learning that Amelia wasn't just some stranger. She was Sarah's mother-in-law. He explained that Amelia often brought the little boy to work, and he'd assumed she was just the child's babysitter. When he realized that the boy was actually Sarah's son, Ardell was floored. He said the only reason he agreed to the murder was because he believed Sarah was racist, and he thought he was punishing her for that. But now he understood he'd been manipulated from the very start. Of course, there was no one doing what he had already done. And for detectives, the real challenge was still ahead. Ardell's confession alone wasn't enough to put Amelia away. They needed hard evidence to prove she'd orchestrated the murder. Talking to staff at the nursing home, detectives found a woman willing to cooperate in exchange for full immunity. She told them that on the day of the murder, Ardell had asked her to help him become a killer by renting a car for him, since he was too young to do it himself. She thought he was joking and went along with it. But just a few hours after she handed over the rental, Ardell brought it back and his boots were covered in blood. He told her he had just gotten rid of the devil and asked for her help. They drove out to a vacant lot where they burned his bloody boots. On their way back to the car, 2 officers stopped them. The cops searched the vehicle and even found a knife under the seat with blood on the handle. But instead of arresting both of them, they simply took the knife and left. Digging deeper, detectives also discovered that just weeks before the murder, Sarah's mother-in-law had withdrawn $2,500 in cash. Soon after, Ardell deposited nearly the exact same amount into his own bank account, a connection. That was hard to ignore. Lab experts compared Ardell's DNA with the sample found on the machete, and it was a perfect match. That was enough to charge him with murder, and right after that, detectives went after Amelia. She was brought into the station, where she called Lorenzo. She told him she was probably going to prison, and he didn't even ask what for. His reaction was strangely calm. After that, Amelia refused to answer any more questions and demanded a lawyer. Knowing that the evidence they had might not be enough to secure a conviction, the lead detective decided to bluff. He told her that if they uncovered proof Lorenzo knew about the murder, their family would never see the child again. Amelia sat in that room for a few hours before finally giving in. She waived her right to an attorney and told detectives she was ready to confess. She admitted that she had never really liked Sarah and thought she was ungrateful. Things only got worse after the baby was born. Amelia believes Sarah wasn't raising him properly, but Sarah never listened to her. Over the next few months, the tension kept building, and their arguments became more and more frequent. When Sarah finally filed for divorce, Amelia panicked, afraid she'd never see her grandson again. And that's when she snapped. She wanted revenge, but insisted she never meant for Sarah to be killed. According to Amelia, she had casually mentioned her frustrations to Ardell at work, and he told her she needed to get back at Sarah for the disrespect. He even offered to help, promising to take care of it. Amelia claimed that Ardell told her he only planned to throw rocks at Sarah's house to scare her. Detectives doubted that version of events, especially since Amelia had paid him a large amount of money, far too much for something as petty as tossing a few stones. In the end, Amelia said no one else in her family, including Lorenzo, knew anything about her involvement. Investigators never found any evidence to prove otherwise, so prosecutors went ahead and sent the case to court. The first to stand trial was Ardell. He claimed Amelia had manipulated him, tricking him into killing an innocent woman. He even said he'd spent the past months praying for Sarah and her family. But the jury wasn't moved, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia's trial began in January 2000, and not a single member of her family showed up. Her lawyer tried to argue there wasn't enough to directly tie her to the murder, but the evidence was stacked against her. In the end, she too was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. In 2009, she filed an appeal, claiming Sarah didn't deserve to die and that she had long since forgiven her. This questionable statement had no effect, and the original sentence was upheld. As for Sarah's son, he continued living with his father. Lorenzo eventually remarried and had 3 more children. On February 8, 2023, he passed away at the age of 57. Amelia, now 89 years old, is still serving her life sentence. Ardell eventually became eligible for parole, but when he applied in 2024, his request was denied. He remains behind bars to this day. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button. A student headed out for her shift at a furniture store, but after sending one unsettling message, she suddenly stopped answering calls and texts. Police opened an investigation, and the case quickly caught the attention of all of Los Angeles before making headlines across the country. And when the full story of what happened finally came out, it sparked outrage nationwide, an anger that still hasn't faded to this day. Brianna Kupfer was born on April 9, 1997, in Los Angeles, California. She grew up in a big, lively family with a younger sister and 2 brothers. From an early age, Brianna stood out for how driven she was. She was a straight-A student, the captain of her school's cheerleading team, and someone who always seemed to be surrounded by friends. Later, she went on to study public relations at the University of Miami and even spent some time in Australia as part of a student exchange program. After graduating, Brianna moved back home and enrolled in a graduate program at UCLA, focusing on architectural and interior design. She was deeply passionate about creativity, especially fashion. Brianna loved sketching designs, sewing her own clothes, and dreamed of one day launching her own collection. She was also very active. She practiced yoga, danced, and even took up boxing. After returning to Los Angeles, she lived with her parents for a while, but eventually decided to move closer to campus and got an apartment with a friend. To help cover living expenses, Brianna started working as a consultant at a high-end furniture store. On January 13, 2022, 24-year-old Brianna headed out for her usual shift. That day, she was scheduled to run the store on her own because she'd agreed to cover a shift for one of her coworkers. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, Brianna sent her manager a message. "Can you call me? There's a customer here and I'm getting a weird feeling." But the manager didn't see the message right away. A few minutes later, when she finally called Brianna back, there was no answer. She then tried calling the store's landline and again, no response. Around that same time, a couple walked into the store. Right away, they noticed something was off. There was no one at the front. As they stepped further inside, they noticed something strange behind one of the sofas. When they got closer, they realized with horror that it was a person, covered in blood. The couple immediately ran out of the store and called the police. Officers rushed to the scene and found a young woman lying motionless on the floor, and it was clear she was already gone. Her phone was on the floor near her hand, and judging by the sheer amount of blood around her, they immediately suspected she'd been stabbed multiple times. It also didn't take long for them to confirm that the victim was Brianna. Her body was sent to the medical examiner while detectives began combing through the crime scene. Naturally, their first thought was that this might have been a robbery gone wrong, but that theory didn't hold up for long. Nothing of value had been taken, not even the cash from the register. In fact, it was the opposite. The killer had actually left something behind. Sitting on the counter where Brianna had been working was a small voice recorder, and it was still running. The officers hit play on the recorder, and what they heard left them stunned. It started with the soft jingle of the bell above the store's front door, followed by Brianna's cheerful voice greeting a customer. Then came a man's voice, saying that he and his girlfriend were looking for a new couch. Brianna asked him a few questions and offered to show him some of the models on display. A moment later, the man said he needed to call his girlfriend to check with her and stepped outside. A little while later, he came back in and asked Brianna if she could give him her social media profile, but she'd politely declined. Then, out of nowhere, he asked her if she followed Biden's politics. Brianna simply replied, no. He said he'd come back later, and Brianna offered him a business card. But instead of leaving, he stayed and started saying strange things. I think this government's gone crazy, the man muttered. Then he told her, put your phone down. A few seconds later, he added, relax, I'm not going to hurt you. Then detectives heard the sound of a blade being drawn. Brianna's voice shifted. She was clearly scared. She told the man to leave the store and warned him that she had already called the police. But he didn't listen. In the next moments, captured in chilling detail, the man lunged at her with the knife and began stabbing her. It went on for several minutes. Brianna's terrified voice could be heard pleading with him, saying she could help him, trying anything to make him stop. But he didn't. Eventually her voice went silent. The attacker walked out, leaving only an eerie stillness on the tape. Moments later, Brianna's phone started ringing. It was her manager trying to call her back. A few minutes after that, the recording captured the sound of the couple entering the store and discovering her body, and that wasn't the only audio stored on the device. Months before the murder, the same man had made another recording, where he ranted about how much he hated women. Detectives sent the recorder off to a lab so experts could test it for fingerprints and DNA, and then they moved on to reviewing the store's surveillance footage. There were several cameras in the building, but none of them actually covered the area where the attack happened. Still, the suspect was caught on video when he first approached Brianna's counter. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood up, dark sunglasses, and a medical mask, making it impossible to see his face. From what they could tell, he was roughly average height, medium build, and appeared to be African American. He was also picked up on outdoor cameras right after the murder, walking away from the store. During a thorough sweep of the store, crime scene investigators found a bloody shoe print on one of the couches, likely left when Brianna tried to run outside and the attacker leapt over the couch to cut her off. They also recovered the murder weapon, a 7-inch blade that had been bent from the sheer force of the stabbing. Not long after, the coroner's report came back. Brianna had been stabbed 46 times. There were also no signs of actual assault. All of this painted a grim picture for detectives. It looked like they were dealing with someone who had no real motive, other than the urge to kill. And judging by the way he was dressed, investigators also considered the possibility that the man might be homeless, which made tracking him down even harder. While waiting on the lab results, detectives kept digging for more surveillance footage, anything that might show the suspect again. Before long, they discovered that about 30 minutes after the murder, he walked into a grocery store. They also got a tip from an employee at a chiropractic clinic located just a few doors down from Brianna's workplace. She told police that the man had come in only minutes before the murder, asked a few questions about their services, and then left. Detectives canvassed other businesses along that same street and learned that the man had walked into several of them as well, only to leave almost immediately. Piecing everything together, they realized he'd likely been hunting for someone who was alone. In every other place he'd tried, there were either multiple staff members or other customers present. In total, he'd gone into 6 different businesses before finally walking into Brianna's store. News of Brianna's murder spread through Los Angeles like wildfire, sparking outrage across the city. People were furious, not just because of what happened to Brianna, but because crime in Los Angeles had been climbing at an alarming rate, while officials seemed to be doing little to stop it. In fact, many pointed to controversial policies like zero bail releases for suspects and reduced time requirements for early parole as part of the problem. There was also anger over the fact that Brianna had been left to work in the store alone, a circumstance that many believed had made her an easy target. But all the media attention also gave detectives a glimmer of hope that someone might recognize the killer. Police released photos of the man through social media and news outlets, and they announced a massive reward, $250,000, for any information leading to his arrest. Most of that reward money came from the store where Brianna worked. The size of the reward attracted hundreds of tips, but none of them led anywhere. Days went by with no breakthrough until the lab results finally came in. Forensic experts matched DNA found on the murder weapon to a 31-year-old man named Sean Smith. Even so, just as detectives had suspected, Sean had no fixed address, which made finding him a lot harder. Police sent out information about him all over the city, and soon after, the media got hold of Sean's criminal record. It turned out he'd been arrested over and over again for a mix of minor and more serious crimes. Things like drug possession and theft, but also incidents that were far more alarming. Once, he attacked a police officer and bit his finger. In another case, he fired a flare gun into a car with a child inside. He'd also been arrested multiple times for trespassing. Not long before Brianna's murder, Sean had been released early from yet another short prison sentence and almost immediately violated the terms of his release. But instead of being sent back to prison, he simply vanished, slipping through the cracks of the system. When people learned all of this, their anger only grew. Here was a man who'd been given chance after chance, serving short sentences and walking free again and again, until he finally committed a murder that might have been prevented. Meanwhile, detectives kept chasing down every tip that came in, but none of them brought them any closer to finding Sean. This went on until January 19th. That day, they got a call from a man driving through the city. He told police he'd just seen someone who looked exactly like the suspect from the CCTV footage. To be sure, he circled the block and drove past him again, this time noticing the exact same backpack that had been seen in the surveillance footage. Officers rushed to the area and soon spotted the man. He matched Sean's description perfectly, but when they approached him, he gave them a different name. Of course, they didn't buy it. Instead, they brought a portable fingerprint scanner, and within minutes, it confirmed what they already suspected. The man standing in front of them was Sean Smith. He was taken into custody on the spot, but even then, Sean refused to admit what he'd done. Prosecutors immediately made it clear they'd be pursuing the harshest sentence possible. But the death penalty was never on the table. Despite the fact that many people in the city were calling for it, the district attorney publicly stated that he opposed capital punishment, saying it wasn't an effective deterrent and calling it a racially biased practice. A few months after his arrest, Sean underwent a full psychiatric evaluation, and the results were clear. He had been fully aware of his actions. Then, out of nowhere, he announced that he wanted to represent himself in court. The judge granted him that right, but it didn't last long. At his very first hearing, Sean lashed out and insulted the judge. The court immediately revoked his right to self-representation and assigned him a public defender instead. Not long after that, Sean entered an official plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, despite the psychiatric evaluation clearly showing the opposite. The main trial began in late August 2024, 3 years after the murder. By that time, the prosecution had everything they needed: surveillance footage, fingerprints, and DNA evidence. For Sean, the only hope left was to convince the jury he was insane at the time of the crime. The defense had no real arguments to prove his innocence. They didn't call a single witness, nor did they present any evidence. Instead, Sean's attorney focused on trying to convince the jury that this was a spontaneous act, not something premeditated, even though it was clear from the investigation that Sean had walked into 6 other businesses looking for a victim before attacking Brianna. The attorney also tried to play on the jury's emotions, arguing that this case only got so much media attention because Brianna was white and Sean was African American, suggesting the whole thing was unfairly biased. During the trial, the court also played the tape from the recorder, the one that captured Brianna's final moments. Before it started, the judge gave her family permission to step outside, sparing them from having to relive that horror. Later, the judge ordered that this recording must never be released to the public. The jury also listened to other recordings, one where Sean spoke openly about his hatred toward women and his desire to hurt them. By the time the trial wrapped up, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury spent barely an hour behind closed doors before returning to the courtroom, and their decision was clear. Sean was guilty. A few months later, he was brought back before the judge for sentencing. Several psychiatrists evaluated him once again, and every single one of them concluded that there were no serious mental conditions that could excuse what he'd done. On top of that, the judge played several recordings taken from the jail where Sean had been waiting for trial. In 3 separate phone calls with friends and relatives, he openly said that all he had to do was play crazy, and instead of prison, he'd be sent to a hospital for 5 years and then walk free. He spoke with complete confidence that his plan would work, apparently forgetting that every word of those calls was being recorded. Because of those recordings, there was no longer any doubt. Sean was ruled mentally competent and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. However, there was a catch. Under new California laws, even people given life without parole are technically allowed to apply for parole later on. Still, the judge said he hoped every single one of Sean's future petitions would be denied, given the sheer brutality of his crime. As for his motive, no clear reason ever came out during the trial. Based on the recordings from his own recorder, Sean simply harbored a deep hatred for women and wanted to hurt them. And the fact that he walked into 6 other businesses before attacking Brianna shows one chilling thing. He didn't care who it was as long as it was a woman. So, Sean was sent off to serve his sentence. But Brianna's case didn't end there. It became yet another stark reminder of how flawed the legal and correctional systems can be. Systems that let dangerous offenders slip through the cracks, serve only light sentences, and walk free even when they pose a clear threat to others. And yet, despite the outrage and the calls for change, nothing meaningful has been done to fix the situation. In California, a lenient attitude toward offenders still remains, even in the face of cases like this. In Brianna's memory, hundreds of people gathered outside the store where her life was taken. They built a makeshift memorial filled with flowers, her photos, and signs demanding action, pleading with authorities to finally do something about the violence in their city. A student headed off to university for her classes, but she never made it back home. When police stepped in, they quickly uncovered chilling clues, but that was only the beginning. By the time they finally solved this case, it had shaken not just all of Australia, but far beyond its borders, and its echoes are still felt to this day. Sophie Colombe was born in 1993 in a small French village called Saint-Julien-Mont-Denis. It was a quiet, picturesque place in the Alps, where Sophie grew up with her parents and 2 older brothers. From an early age, she had a passion for music and even played in her village's local ensemble. She also dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing school, Sophie moved to Denmark to study international business, and later she went to Germany for an internship. Then, in 2013, she was accepted into a master's program at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. She moved there with her boyfriend, and the 2 of them rented an apartment near the university. But a year later, his visa expired and he returned to France. Sophie still had 1 more year left to finish, and at first she thought about going back with him. In the end, though, she decided to stay and complete her degree. On top of her studies, Sophie worked several jobs just to make ends meet, waiting tables, doing cleaning work, and even giving private French lessons. But it still wasn't enough to afford her own place, so she moved in with some university friends who were sharing an apartment. On the morning of March 27, 2014, 21-year-old Sophie set out for the university as usual. That day, her classes were scheduled to run late into the evening. Throughout the day, she kept in touch with her boyfriend, messaging back and forth, until sometime that evening she suddenly stopped replying. By the next morning, there was still no word from her, and he began to panic. After trying and failing to reach her by phone, he went online to check the Brisbane Police Department's social media page, hoping for any sign of her. That's when he stumbled on a brand new post. Police had uploaded photos of several pieces of women's jewelry, asking the public for help identifying who they belonged to. The moment he saw those pictures, his heart sank. He knew those items immediately. They were Sophie's. He called the Brisbane police right away and told them what he'd seen. And that's when they finally told him what had happened. Early that morning, police were contacted by a homeless man who lived in a park not far from Sophie's apartment. He told them that while walking through the park, he'd noticed someone lying on a bench, covered with old newspapers as if trying to keep warm. At first, he thought it was just another person sleeping rough for the night, but when he got closer, he saw it was a young woman. He tried to wake her, shook her shoulder, called out to her, but there was no response. That's when he noticed blood matted in her hair. He reached out to check for a pulse and felt nothing. Realizing she was dead, he immediately went to the police. Officers confirmed that the young woman had died and sent her body to medical examiners. The autopsy revealed a devastating head injury, the fatal blow with a heavy object. They also found numerous abrasions and confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted. Investigators concluded she'd been attacked just a few yards from that bench and then dragged over and left there. Whoever did it had placed her on the bench and covered her with newspapers, likely hoping her body would go unnoticed. And in that park, it made sense. The area was a known hangout for the homeless, and seeing someone asleep on a bench was nothing unusual. If that's what the killer was counting on, it worked. According to medical experts, the attack happened the previous evening, but Sophie didn't die right away. She lived for several more hours. She remained on that bench until late into the night, slowly succumbing to her injuries. If someone had called for help, doctors might have been able to save her. But no one called. Most people, it seems, simply thought she was another homeless person asleep in the dark. Once police sent Sophie's boyfriend a photo of the victim and he confirmed it was her, detectives threw everything they had into the investigation. One of their first priorities was to find her clothes and belongings, because when her body was discovered, she was wearing nothing but her jewelry. But after combing through the park and checking every nearby trash bin, they didn't find a single trace. Investigators then began piecing together Sophie's final day, step by step, to try and retrace her movements. Footage from a CCTV camera near her apartment showed her leaving that morning and boarding a bus to the university. She spent almost the entire day on campus, and at about 8:30 that evening, she headed home. By then, it had started raining. A classmate offered to give her a lift, but Sophie turned him down, saying she'd just take the bus. Cameras near the bus stops captured her getting on and later getting off at her usual stop. From there, she would have needed to walk across a bridge over the river to get home. But to reach that bridge, she first had to cut through the very same park where her body was later found. After that point, there was no more footage, nothing to show what happened next. Detectives turned to the public, hoping someone might have seen something that rainy night. But almost no one had been out in that weather. And that gave the killer the perfect chance to attack her in the middle of that tiny park without being seen. Police also asked the public to keep an eye out for any of Sophie's missing belongings. She'd been carrying a phone, a tablet, an umbrella, and her handbag. When none of those items turned up in the park, they brought in divers to search the river. Before long, the divers found an umbrella about a mile downstream. But even then, investigators couldn't say for sure if it belonged to Sophie. News of Sophie's murder immediately drew massive attention across the city, and for more than one reason. First, police openly admitted they couldn't rule out the possibility that the killer might strike again. And second, Sophie was the fourth international student murdered in Brisbane in just a few months. Even though those other cases were unrelated and the suspects in them had already been caught, people were starting to see a chilling pattern, and the sense of unease kept growing. Meanwhile, Detectives kept digging through surveillance footage near the park, combing through hours upon hours of video. Then, finally, they spotted someone. A man walking past the park both before and after the estimated time of Sophie's death. That time window had been narrowed down almost to the minute, based on Sophie's movements captured by other cameras. What really made him stand out wasn't just how often he appeared near the park. It was the fact that he never came forward, despite repeated public appeals asking anyone who'd been in the area that night to contact police. Even with the heavy rain, dozens of people reached out saying they'd passed through or nearby at some point. But this man's name never came up. Investigators tried to follow his trail. Cameras showed him entering a subway station near the park and riding a few stops. After that, though, the trail went cold. They suspected he might have been heading toward the train station near the airport, possibly to catch a train out of the city. Detectives went back to the park to speak with people who'd spent most of their time there, hoping someone might recognize the man from the footage. Before long, they found a witness who said he'd actually been drinking with that man on the night of the murder. According to him, the man's name was Ben, and he'd been staying at a homeless hostel a few miles from the park, on the other side of the river. That hostel already had a bad reputation. Many of the residents were recently released prisoners with nowhere else to go. Police headed over there and showed staff a photo of the man from the surveillance footage. They recognized him immediately and confirmed that he was indeed one of their residents, 25-year-old Benjamin Millward. The staff also mentioned something unsettling. They hadn't seen Benjamin since the night Sophie was killed. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind almost all of his belongings, as if he'd left in a hurry. All of this gave police every reason to dig deeper, and finding Benjamin quickly became their top priority. 8 days after the murder, they went public with his name and photo, asking anyone with information on his whereabouts to come forward. As detectives looked into his background, they discovered that Benjamin had quite a record. Back in 2012, he'd been released from prison, where he was serving time for assault. But soon after, he was arrested again for violating parole and only gained full freedom in 2013. On top of that, his record included theft, charges, and a string of lesser offenses. Investigators also learned something else while speaking with other hostel residents. One of them said that just hours before Sophie's murder, Benjamin had been heavily drunk and under the influence of drugs. Benjamin even admitted to him that he hadn't used in a long time, and the last time he did, things went badly. Another resident reported seeing Benjamin in the park around 5 p.m. taking another dose. After that, they went their separate ways because the resident wanted to get back to the hostel before it locked up at 9 p.m. Benjamin, however, never returned that night. That same resident recalled spotting him outside the building around 11 p.m. after Sophie's murder and said Benjamin looked deeply unsettled, nervous, and was acting strangely. While police waited for leads on his whereabouts, Benjamin's relatives and acquaintances began reaching out. Every single one of them insisted they didn't believe he could be involved in a murder. His family said they hadn't heard from him since the day Sophie was killed, and they even went on TV pleading with him to come forward and clear his name. But Benjamin stayed silent, and detectives grew more and more convinced that he'd already left the city. They circulated his photo and details to other towns and states, hoping someone would spot him. Before long, they got a promising lead. Staff at a small hotel in a town called Balina, located in another state, reported that a man matching Benjamin's description had stayed with them for a few days, but he was already gone. Police immediately alerted officers in nearby towns, warning them that Benjamin might be moving through the area. And soon enough, 2 officers in a coastal city called Coffs Harbor, just a few dozen miles from that hotel, noticed a man on the street in the middle of the night who looked just like him. They approached and asked, "Are you Benjamin?" And the man calmly replied, Yeah, you got me. Is this because of the internet?" He was immediately arrested and extradited back to Brisbane. Detectives took his DNA and had matched the skin particles found under Sophie's fingernails, finally and undeniably tying him to her murder. After Benjamin was placed in custody to await trial, his lawyer spoke to the media. He said his client was feeling overwhelmed by all the pressure surrounding the case, but otherwise he was doing fine. Once in court, Benjamin didn't try to deny what he'd done. During the proceedings, He admitted to the murder in front of the judge and even asked Sophie's family for forgiveness. But then he revealed a detail that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. According to him, after attacking and assaulting Sophie, he told her he was going to get help. Yet instead, he simply walked away, leaving her to die alone on that park bench in the pouring rain. Before fleeing the city, he also threw all of her belongings into the river. As for his motive, Benjamin claimed that he hadn't been in control of himself, blaming everything on the drugs he'd taken. He said he barely remembered the attack at all, recalling only fragments of what he'd done to her. However, experts cast serious doubt on Benjamin's claims. They explained that the substances he'd taken on the day of the murder typically don't drive someone to commit a crime this violent, and certainly not something so calculated. His condition, they said, couldn't be used as an excuse. On top of that, the drugs wouldn't normally cause such severe memory loss, yet Benjamin insisted he could barely remember anything. And, as investigators pointed out, he'd been clear-headed enough to buy train tickets and leave the city without drawing attention to himself. In the end, the court sentenced Benjamin to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. He also received an additional 15 years for the sexual assault to be served at the same time. So, given his age, Benjamin could still walk free before he turns 50. It's also worth noting that Benjamin's mother spoke to reporters after the trial. She praised her son for admitting what he'd done and said she blamed the drugs for everything that happened, insisting that he would never have done something like this sober. In the end, the case was solved relatively quickly, but the shockwaves it sent through Brisbane lasted much longer. After Sophie's death, locals demanded that authorities step up security in that park and called out the hostel for accepting anyone at all, including recently released violent offenders and murderers. Many women came forward with their own stories of being harassed in that same park, saying they'd never once seen police in that area. Memorials were held all over the city. More than 2,000 people joined a candlelight march, following the route Sophie should have taken home that night. Her funeral took place in her hometown in France, and it drew nearly 1,200 people out of a village of just 1,500. It became the largest funeral the village had seen in decades, since the death of a beloved mayor. So many came to pay their respects that mourners ended up filling 8 entire journals with condolences. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A student went to bed in her room, but just minutes later, a fire broke out. When firefighters rushed in, something fell off right away. Police got involved, and detectives started piecing together a series of unsettling clues and testimonies. What they uncovered was a dark, tangled truth, one that would leave everyone shaken. Andrea Del Vesco was born on June 29, 1994, in Chicago, Illinois. She had an older brother, a younger sister, and parents she was incredibly close to. Andrea also came from a well-off family. Her dad ran an investment firm. After her little sister was born, the family moved to Austin, Texas, where Andrea enrolled in a prestigious Christian school. She stood out fast. She played on the field hockey and lacrosse teams and racked up a bunch of awards, especially for studying languages like Spanish and Latin. When she graduated, Andrea applied to several top colleges. In the end, she chose UCLA, planning to earn degrees in psychology and Spanish. She loved the language and seriously thought about moving to a Spanish-speaking country one day. Her parents had hoped she'd pick a university in Chicago because her older brother was studying there and could keep an eye on her. But they ultimately supported her choice, and she headed to California. In her first week on campus, she joined a sorority and quickly made friends. Andrea moved into the dorms with them and spent the next few years working hard toward her degrees. She also picked up part-time jobs whenever she could. Even though her family could provide everything she needed, she wanted to pull her own weight. In 2015, when Andrea was 21, she entered her senior year. At UCLA, sorority and fraternity members in their final years could rent small apartment-style complexes just off campus. It was considered a big deal, both prestigious and a chance to finally live a bit more independently outside the dorms. Andrea and her sorority friends jumped at the opportunity and rented a place just a short walk from the university. Around that same time, Andrea adopted a little chihuahua from a shelter, and soon after, she began volunteering there on a regular basis. September was an especially important month for her sorority. It was recruitment season when they welcomed new freshmen into the house, so Andrea and her friends were busy preparing for it. On the night of September 20th, they spent hours working together, setting up displays, painting posters, making decorations, and getting everything ready for the big event. As the night wore on, the girls started heading to their rooms one by one. Andrea stayed up with a friend in the living room, chatting until 3:30 in the morning. Eventually, she dozed off on the couch, but a little while later she woke up and went to her bedroom. A few hours later, Andrea's roommate, who lived upstairs, was suddenly woken by the sound of a woman screaming and a dog barking. The noise seemed to be coming from downstairs, so she tried calling her, but Andrea didn't pick up. Concerned, she decided to call the police, and officers arrived within minutes. By the time they entered the building, everything had gone quiet. They walked through the place but didn't find any signs of a break-in or anything unusual. Most of the other girls were still asleep, so the officers chose not to disturb them. Thinking it might have just been a nightmare or maybe nothing serious at all, they left. But only minutes later, Andrea's roommate heard a loud crash from below. She rushed out onto her balcony, and that's when she saw smoke pouring from Andrea's room, followed by flames spreading fast. To her shock, she also saw a man wrapped in a blanket running out of Andrea's room. At that moment, the fire alarms went off and the students started evacuating. Some of Andrea's friends tried to get into her room, but the door was locked. A strange detail, since the girls never locked their doors. Using a spare key, they finally got it open. Inside, Andrea's room was filled with smoke and flames. Through the haze, they could barely make out the outline of a person lying motionless on the bed. They shouted Andrea's name, but there was no answer. The fire spread too quickly, and they had no choice but to get out. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was in chaos. The students huddled outside, and it didn't take long for everyone to realize Andrea was missing. The fire spread quickly through the building, and it took 32 firefighters more than 15 minutes to finally put it out. When they were able to enter Andrea's room, they found a body lying on the bed, and that's when the police immediately got involved. The fire had done so much damage that the body couldn't be identified by sight. It was handed over to the medical examiner, but detectives quickly realized who it had to be. Other students told them that the room was Andrea's, and she was the only one who hadn't made it out that night. Firefighters also found Andrea's chihuahua live in the room, and the dog was quickly taken to a vet clinic for treatment. Even though medical confirmation would take time, word of the tragedy spread across campus almost instantly. Within hours, thousands of students at UCLA had heard about it, and most assumed Andre had died in some kind of accident, maybe an electrical short or something like a candle left burning. But firefighters had their doubts right away. All the outlets were intact, and there was no sign of any accidental source of fire in the room. What they did notice was strange. Sitting on the bed right next to the body was a trash can. That in itself seemed suspicious. After looking more closely, they concluded that the fire had started there, which meant someone had put the trash can on the bed and deliberately set it on fire. It was nearly impossible to believe Andrea could have done that to herself. Firefighters shared their findings with the police, and soon, forensic investigators were going through the room in detail. What they discovered made the case even darker. There were large bloodstains spread across the bed and on the floor. That detail alone shattered the theory of a tragic accident, because in a real accidental fire, there would have been no reason for blood to be there at all. Meanwhile, the medical examiners worked to confirm the victim's identity, but the fire had been so intense that even her fingerprints were gone. In the end, they were able to confirm it was Andrea by using dental records. What they found next was shocking. Her body showed 19 stab wounds, which completely ruled out any possibility of an accident. There was another crucial detail. The examiners discovered no smoke in her lungs. That meant Andrea was already dead before the fire even started. As for sexual assault, there were no clear signs. But because the body was so badly damaged by the flames, they couldn't say for certain. What they could confirm was that there was no trace of the attacker's DNA left behind. The case was now officially a homicide investigation. ABD detectives began questioning all of the sorority members who lived in the complex. They learned Andrea didn't have a boyfriend at the time, and she didn't seem to have conflicts with anyone. One of the students, the same one who had called the police before the fire, shared an unsettling detail. That night, she had driven her boyfriend to the airport and got back home around 5:30 in the morning. She entered the courtyard of the sorority house, where the stairs led up to her room. As she walked up and started unlocking her door, she suddenly heard a noise behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the moment he noticed her, he bolted. Frightened, she quickly went inside her room. She thought about calling the police, but convinced herself not to. Maybe he was just someone visiting one of the other girls, or maybe another student passing through. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but she remembered what he was wearing. A black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt and jeans. Still unsettled, she phoned her boyfriend and told him what happened. He reassured her and eventually she went to sleep. But just 45 minutes later, she woke to the sound of commotion downstairs. The same noise that made her call the police. After the officers left, she once again heard noises. Stepping out onto her balcony, she caught sight of a man climbing out of Andrea's window, wrapped in a red blanket, and she instantly knew it was the same guy she'd seen near the staircase less than an hour earlier. She shouted after him, but he ran off. She rushed outside, hoping to see where he went, but by then he was gone. What she did notice, though, was a red Nissan driving away from the area. She couldn't make out the license plate, but there was something else on the rear windshield. 3 big letters. She recognized them right away. It was the abbreviation of a fraternity called Lambda Chi Alpha. Detectives were intrigued by this lead, but they also knew it might not mean anything. That neighborhood was packed with students and notorious for big parties. So the red Nissan could have just belonged to some random college kid heading home from one of them. Still, investigators followed up. They questioned every member of Lambda Chi Alpha, the fraternity whose letters were spotted on the car, but none of them admitted to owning a red Nissan, nor did they know who it belonged to. Detectives then spoke with students who lived in the complex across the street from Andreas, and that's when they learned about another crime that same night. The students said their place had been burglarized. Someone had stolen a laptop, a Bluetooth speaker, and a few other items. This detail caught investigators' attention. They soon learned that in order to use that stolen Bluetooth speaker, the new owner would first have to register it online through the manufacturer's website. Detectives wasted no time. They reached out to the company, handed over the serial number, and asked to be alerted the moment someone tried to activate it. While detectives waited for a call, news of Andrea's death spread far beyond the UCLA campus. At first, investigators didn't reveal that they were dealing with the homicide. Most people, including Andrea's own family, believed she had died in some kind of tragic accident. Her parents only learned the awful truth later from Andrea's sorority sisters. By then, her family had already flown to Los Angeles. Her mother demanded to see the body herself because she couldn't bring herself to believe Andrea was really gone. As for Andrea's dog, vets tried desperately to save the little chihuahua, but it didn't make it. Heartbroken, her parents went to the clinic to say goodbye, and later said that at least the dog would now be with Andrea in heaven. Meanwhile, detectives were still chasing the lead on the red Nissan, but came up empty-handed. Days passed with no progress until the call finally came in. The stolen Bluetooth speaker had just been activated, and the detectives now had an IP address. Traced back to a man named Joseph, living in Fresno, about 3 hours away from UCLA. Police headed straight to his home, and Joseph admitted he had registered the speaker online, but insisted it wasn't his. He said it belonged to his roommate, a man named Alberto. According to Joseph, Alberto had left for Los Angeles a few days earlier to attend a concert and came back on September 22nd, just 1 day after Andrea's murder. When he returned, he wasn't empty-handed. He brought back the stolen Bluetooth speaker, along with other random items like dishes, towels, and bottles of alcohol. When asked where it all came from, Alberto told him a friend in Los Angeles had just moved and gave him the things he didn't want to take along. Detectives dug deeper and found out Alberto was a 22-year-old student at Fresno State University who had no criminal record. Still, his whereabouts were unclear, and it took investigators several days to track down the house he was staying in. On September 26th, officers surrounded the home and arrested Alberto. At the station, he claimed he had gone to Los Angeles to visit a friend who lived near UCLA. Together, they went to a concert, then spent the next few days hopping from party to party before he headed back home. When a detective asked him about the Bluetooth speaker, Alberto pretended not to know what they were talking about. But once they confronted him with proof that the stolen speaker had been found in his roommate's home, his story changed. Now, he said the speaker had actually been brought by his friend from Los Angeles, who supposedly gave him a ride back to Fresno. But detectives quickly uncovered another inconsistency. Alberto's own roommate told them he saw Alberto return home alone, carrying the speaker and the rest of the stolen items into the garage. Caught in the lie, Alberto switched his story again. This time, he admitted he had stolen them himself. He explained that he and his friend had gone to a student party that night where some of the people were acting rude. Drunk and annoyed, he decided to teach them a lesson by stealing their things, laptop, the speaker, and whatever else he could grab. He insisted he was so intoxicated that he barely knew what he was doing. Alberto added one more detail. He claimed that around 5:30 a.m. after leaving that party, he and his friend were confronted by a man hiding behind a dumpster. The man pulled out a gun and demanded their stuff. Instead of handing it over, they ran, and the stranger fired a shot in their direction. When detectives asked for a description of this gunman, Alberto gave one, and it matched perfectly with what Andrea's neighbor had seen that same night. Detectives, of course, weren't quick to buy Alberto's story, especially since no neighbors had reported hearing gunshots that morning. Still, they pressed him further, asking if he had gone into any women's dorms while he was in Los Angeles. Alberto said he had met two students through a mutual friend, but insisted that was the extent of it. Detectives pushed harder, telling him they didn't believe a word he was saying. Under pressure, Alberto changed his story yet again. This time, he claimed that during the same party where he'd stolen the speaker, his friend Eric had met a girl who lived just across the street and decided to go with her. Alberto said he didn't know her name, but when he gave a description, it matched Andrea. Then he went further. He described what she was wearing that night, even down to her underwear, and eventually slipped up and said her name. Detectives realized he was likely lying, spinning stories as he went along, but they also knew they had to squeeze out as many details as possible. When they pushed him to recall more, Alberto put his head in his hands, went silent for a few seconds, then finally muttered, "All right." It was Eric. According to Alberto, just minutes after Eric went off with the girl, he came running back, clearly shaken. He told Alberto they needed to get out of there immediately because he had done something serious. Eric admitted he had attacked the girl, and together they left the party. According to Alberto, Eric threw away a pair of rubber gloves as they left, gloves he'd been wearing when he came out of the student's house. Finally, Alberto claimed that sometime later, after the party, he saw news of Andrea's murder and realized what his friend had done. He messaged Eric, demanding the truth, and Eric confessed to killing her. Detectives still weren't convinced by Alberto's shifting story, but they had no choice but to check it out. They asked where Eric lived, and Alberto pointed them to an apartment complex just 5 minutes from Andrea's place. Police knocked on Eric's door and started asking questions about that night. Eric admitted that he and Alberto had been at the party, but claimed nothing unusual happened. According to him, they got back to his apartment around 3 a.m., and he didn't wake up until closer to 8. He also said he had been very drunk, so his memory of the night was fuzzy. Detectives kept pressing, but Eric stuck to his version. That's when police noticed something important. Eric's apartment complex had surveillance cameras everywhere, so they immediately pulled the footage from the night of Andrea's murder. What they saw blew holes in both men's stories. The footage showed Alberto and Eric walking back into the building at 2:40 a.m., and right away, detectives spotted something striking. One of them was wearing a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans, the exact outfit Andrea's neighbor had described. And it wasn't Eric. It was Alberto. Later footage showed both men leaving the apartment again around 4:30 a.m. They went downstairs, hung around drinking for a while, and then disappeared off camera. The next time they were seen was at 7:11 that morning, returning home. And there was no mistaking it. Alberta was wrapped in the very same red blanket Andrea's sorority sister had seen on the man fleeing her balcony. By this point, detectives had little doubt about Alberto's involvement, but they were still trying to figure out what role, if any, Eric had played. They brought him back in for questioning and showed him the surveillance footage, demanding he come clean. But Eric stuck to his story. He claimed he was so drunk, he barely remembered anything at all, not even leaving the apartment or where they had gone. Even so, investigators now had enough evidence to arrest both men and secure search warrants for their homes. Once they were booked into jail, officers noticed something troubling. Alberto's hands were covered in scratches. They looked exactly like defensive wounds, marked someone might leave behind while fighting him off. When asked about it, Alberto shrugged it off, saying he got into a fight at a party, but couldn't remember with whom. Soon after, forensic teams combed through Eric's apartment. They spotted stains that looked like someone had tried to wash away blood and quickly sent the samples to the lab for testing. Next, detectives tracked down Alberto's car, the red Nissan with the fraternity letters on the back window. It turned out Alberto had once been a member of Lambda Chi Alpha, but not at UCLA. He'd been a part of a chapter in Fresno before being kicked out for bad behavior. Finally, police searched Alberto's home. What they found left no room for doubt. A trash bag containing the same red blanket seen by Andrea's neighbor, a bloody knife, and Alberto's clothing, including his underwear. Even more disturbing, the bag also contained a pair of women's underwear. All of the evidence was sent to the lab for testing. In the meantime, one of Alberto's neighbors came forward with something that immediately caught detectives' attention. He said that when Alberto came back from Los Angeles, he told them that a student had been murdered right across the street from where he'd been at a party. What stood out wasn't just that Alberto knew about the killing, it was the level of detail. According to the neighbor, Alberto described the crime scene in graphic precision, that the victim had been assaulted, stabbed, and then the house was set on fire to cover it up. None of those details had ever been released publicly. Alberto even boasted that the police would never catch the person who did it, because the crime had been done too cleanly. Detectives strongly disagreed, though. They kept digging into the mountain of evidence piling up against him. When forensics finished processing Alberto's car, it, too, was covered in blood. Samples from the vehicle, the knife, and Alberto's clothing all came back with the same result. The blood belonged to Andrea. With that confirmation, prosecutors moved forward. Both Alberto and Eric were formally charged with murder. But detectives still weren't convinced Eric had played an active role. He might not have even known what his friend had done. But with the evidence tying both men to the scene, they had little choice but to charge him alongside Alberto. After they were locked up and this information hit the news, a new witness came forward. He told police that around 5:30 that morning, he had been outside near Andrea's house collecting plastic bottles. While he was there, a man walked up to him and asked if he knew how to fight. The witness said no, and the man headed straight toward Andrea's building. The witness also noticed a red Nissan parked nearby, with another person sitting inside. When detectives brought him to the station, he immediately identified the man who had approached him. It was Alberto. This testimony became an important piece of the puzzle. It showed that Alberto had been the one who approached Andrea's home, while Eric had been sitting in the car. That made Eric's direct involvement in the murder seem even less likely, so investigators now leant toward the idea that Eric truly might not have known what his friend was about to do. Eventually, prosecutors changed Eric's charges. Instead of murder, he now faced counts of aiding and abetting, along with burglary from the other house that night. In 2017, Eric's lawyer negotiated a deal. The prosecution agreed to try him separately from Alberto. Eric pled guilty to the reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. Alberto's trial began in 2018, and by then, prosecutors had added another charge, animal cruelty, because of the death of Andrea's dog. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming case against him. They argued that Alberto had climbed into Andrea's home through the balcony. Maybe at first he didn't plan to kill her. Maybe he just wanted to steal something valuable. But when Andrea woke up and saw him, she screamed. That's when, according to prosecutors, he pulled a knife, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Afterward, he set a trash can on fire to destroy evidence, grabbed a blanket, and fled the scene. The defense, on the other hand, had nothing substantial to counter the evidence. They couldn't present a single strong argument for his innocence. So it didn't take long for the jury to reach their decision. Alberto was guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 21st, exactly 3 years to the day after Andrea's murder. On that date, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He emphasized one thing in particular. Throughout the entire trial, Alberto had never shown an ounce of remorse and never admitted to what he had done. In the end, Alberto was sent away to serve his life sentence. But even after the trial was over, one detail continued to haunt Andrea's parents. As we know, Andrea's roommate had already called the police before the fire even started, and based on the timeline, Alberto was likely still inside her room when the officers arrived. He probably stayed hidden, waiting for them to leave, or maybe even threatened her with a knife to keep her silent. That left a painful question Andrea's parents could never escape. Was Andrea already dead at that point? Or was she alive, silenced by Alberto at knife point, too terrified to make a sound? They'll never know for sure. But in their eyes, one thing was clear. If police had checked Andrea's room that night, their daughter might have had a chance to survive. Her parents repeatedly criticized the police department for failing to conduct a more thorough search, but no action was ever taken against the officers. Their explanation was that when they walked through the house, they saw nothing to suggest danger. No signs of forced entry, no sounds of a struggle, only silence. And without stronger evidence, they said, they didn't have enough cause to take further steps. Share your thoughts in the comment section and don't forget to press the like button if you appreciate my video.